President, I particularly appreciate the bipartisan conversation that's going on at the chair, and hope that more of that will go on. And that really comes a little bit to why I rise today, because I hope and pray that while we have many legitimate policy differences in this body, that one thing we ought to have absolute, complete agreement on is that the United States of America cannot afford another government shutdown. The last shutdown, which President Trump was so proud to initiate, cost our economy, and this is the lowest estimate we could find, so we don't look like we're overstating, an estimated $6 billion. But the truth is, that number hardly reflects the human cost of this self-inflicted disaster that our country was led into. A recent survey found that 62% of federal workers depleted most or all of their emergency savings. 42% of federal workers took on debt to pay bills or other expenses. 25% tapped their retirement accounts, and if you tap your IRA, you pay tax penalties. You get none of that reimbursed. And listen to this, Mr. President. 25% of our federal workers who were the victims of this shutdown, 25% of our federal workers during this shutdown had to visit a food bank. If you work for the United States of America, the greatest nation in the world, and you are asked to show up to work without pay, you should not have to go visit a food bank. I spent most of my career in the private sector, and proud of those activities. But I know very few folks who work for any of my companies that would have continued to show up day in and day out, do their jobs, if they were going for 35 days without pay. 35 days without pay, where frankly, you had some members of the so-called board, the Congress, who showed no appreciation at all for their suffering, and many who said they didn't mind if that shutdown had continued indefinitely. Mr. President, those fellow Americans, our federal workers, our contractors, private businesses who support federal installations, or the campground outside the Shenandoah National Forest, or the restaurant outside the Petersburg battlefield, not just federal employees, folks in the private sector as well, endured tremendous hardship because the president decided to use their livelihoods as a bargaining chip. That can't happen again. Unfortunately, and while I want to always try to be optimistic and appreciate the bipartisan agreement that has been reached by the budget negotiators, unfortunately, we find ourselves in this same spot right now, potentially just days away from another Trump shutdown. Now, the president said, quote unquote, he's not happy, but he won't say if he'll sign the bipartisan deal that came from the conference committee. Let's be clear. The uncertainty itself is having a negative impact on the operation of the federal government and costing taxpayer dollars each and every day that this cloud hangs over the government. Agencies are already interrupting investigations, canceling trainings and meetings. They're being forced to act as if the government will once again be shut down at the end of this week. This is just plain mismanagement of government by the Trump administration. And yet it's another example of the disrespect this White House has shown to our federal workforce. In Virginia, over the past few weeks, Senator Kaine and I have spent a lot of time listening to federal workers. We heard from federal workers who had to pull their kids out of daycare and send them away to relatives because they couldn't meet those daycare expenses if they weren't getting paid. Folks who missed student loan payments or literally had to choose between their medications and paying rent. Now, these workers have started to receive some of their back pay, and many of them not fully all of their back pay from the shutdown. But the truth is, even those federal workers, those who drew down their savings or incurred a tax penalty from taking on their IRA or taking an advance on the credit card, they're not made whole by receiving back pay because they have incurred penalties that will never be made up, beyond the psychic damage that's taken place with their families. But even if we accept that most of the federal workers will ultimately get their back pay, that is not the case for thousands of federal contractors in Virginia and around the country who, quite honestly, the nightmare is not over for. The president's decision to finally reopen the government didn't magically undo 35 days of missed pay. Unfortunately, no one from the White House could be bothered to meet with any of these folks, whether it would be federal workers or contractors who were hurt by this government shutdown. But if they had, they would know how much pain this president's shutdown continues to inflict on federal contractors, particularly low and middle income workers. I've spent the last couple of months, or last month and a half, listening to these folks describe the anxiety of not knowing when their next paycheck would come, or if it would come at all. And we're not talking, and sometimes when we think about federal contractors, you think about sometimes high-priced folks, many of them who do a good job working for our government, many of them in my state. That sometimes is the image of a federal contractor. I wonder if most of the members of this body realize that the people who clean the toilets at the Smithsonian or serve the food in the cafeteria at the Smithsonian are federal contractors. And for the 35 days the government shut down, they have no recourse at this moment in time. They are struggling as we speak. And they will continue to struggle if Congress doesn't take advantage of this opportunity, if we get this deal signed by Friday and keep the government open, to make good on our commitment to those contractors as well. If we end up with the alternative and the government shuts down again, these folks' lives, at least their economic lives, will be in jeopardy. The number of small businesses, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, who tried through this last 35-day shutdown to keep their workers on payroll, they had to take that money out of their business pockets to try to make ends too. But I had a lot of them, after a couple of weeks, couldn't afford to do that. And those businesses shut down. Years, in certain cases, decades of work down the drain, not because they did something that was mismanagement, not because they did something that was irresponsible, not because they weren't providing the taxpayers with the full value of their work, but because we here in Congress and this White House couldn't come to a common agreement on the most basic responsibility of government, which is to keep the doors open and the lights on. I held a roundtable recently with a contractor in Springfield, Virginia. A contractor told Barbara that told me she's behind on her rent and had to take her granddaughter out of daycare because she can't pay the bills. Now, she's glad she's back at work. But that 35 days with no pay, unless we rectify that with this deal that may come to pass before the weekend, she is still left in the cold. Another at that same roundtable told me of having to choose between food and medicine. A couple of weeks ago as well, I met a contractor named John, an Afghanistan veteran, who was picking up groceries at the food bank in Arlington because the shutdown had wiped out his savings. We had some press there. John didn't want to go on camera. He was a little bit embarrassed that he had to come and pick up food at the food bank. This was someone who was a veteran. This was someone who continued to serve in terms of protecting a country around homeland security? On 35 days without pay, and as the status quo, he will never get those lost earnings back if we don't rectify that this week. Another contractor named Joseph, who works as a custodian at the Department of the Interior, told me this, quote, "We work just as hard as anyone else. We need our back pay so we can catch up on our bills and survive." And the remarkable thing is, for some of these janitors and custodial workers on buildings that were open, they had to continue to work and still don't get back pay. One of the most heartbreaking things was listening to these contractors talk about the shame of being treated as if their work does not have value. But the truth is, these folks take pride in their work because they love their country. That same contractor, Joseph, says he thinks of the building he cleans as the president's house, and he works hard because he wants to make it shine every day. What a disgrace that this government can't even honor his service with back wages so that he can pay his bills and get his personal finances in order. Many other contractors take pride in their work because it represents their independence. Over 45,000 disabled Americans work as federal contractors through the Ability One program. I know this program is very successful in Delaware, where my son, the senator from Delaware, will speak shortly. I've met contractors who are double amputees, veterans with PTSD, and folks with physical and intellectual disabilities. They are able to live, quote unquote, normal lives and contribute to society because of these federal contractor jobs. For many of them, these jobs are more than about pay. It's about respect. It's about being valued and part of a community, part of a team at the offices they work in. And they suffer more than just about anyone when their lifeline, that source of income, independence, and dignity, is cut off because of a government shutdown. I want to close with something a federal contractor named Constance told me last week. Even though she and her team of custodians still face tremendous financial hardship, she told me that she remains hopeful. She's hopeful because she and her co-workers are now back to work, and she's hopeful because people in this chamber are finally starting to listen to folks like her. I share her hope that the Senate will have the decency and the basic humanity to make sure, one, that we don't close down this government come Friday, but two, that when we come to this deal, we take that moment, and I see colleagues from both sides out. We've gotten a CBO score. It is scored to make sure the back pay for the contractors with an emphasis towards low-income contractors under $50,000. The cost would be at $1 billion. That's the CBO score. But we ought to make sure that these people's lives, the work they do, is valued. So I hope that as we have this bipartisan deal to avoid the shutdown, that we can also put and make it right for the folks who oftentimes many of us don't see, who clean the buildings, serve the food, many folks, again, from the disabled community, who rely upon us to do the right thing. Congress should pass this back pay for federal contractors legislation. The president should sign it. And if the Congress doesn't, the Congress should override his veto. Let's make sure, as we did with federal workers, that they will always be ensured that they will get their back pay. Let's make sure that contractors get that same business and that same decency. It's time to do the right thing. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.